Hi everyone, we're just getting ready, waiting for people to come in. But as we're waiting around, please take some time to do some chair yoga. I don't know if this is your first hour or your 21st hour of 24 hours of UX, but we do have a few more hours to go. And so if you've been sitting at your chair for the past couple of hours, please take some time to stretch. And don't forget your wrists too, because you don't want to develop carpal tunnel.
But really, stretching is so important. I think we all have probably learned that the hard way, just kind of working at home so much.
Yeah, and sometimes when you work from home, it's like you forget that you can actually get out.
Yeah.
You actually leave the computer and get sun and vitamin D and actually take a walk. I do that a lot, especially when you're a workaholic. You just stay tethered to the computer. Yeah. So, you have water?
I've got water.
I don't know. Do you want to do arm circles?
That's an intense workout for a warm-up.
Sorry, my sister, she's in Boston. She's a occupational therapist, and so she works with a lot of elders, seniors.
Yeah.
And so these are the exercises that she makes me do when we do our weekly exercise routine with the parents. My parents are 70 and 80 years old, and so she makes us do all of these like things, like even if you have to stand up, right? And you have to like walk up and down on your heels and toes and heels. And it's a good way to, stretch out your calves and stuff like that.
That's pretty good. I am, I'm really feeling it with these arm circles. I don't remember the last time I did arm circles, but now it just actually feels really nice. So I got to work that into my daily.
You can do this, and then, there's this one that you can do pretty often to your neck. I don't know, I'm just thinking about what else. Oh yeah, this one, if you have armrest, you can just like hold one side and just look on the other. So you can do a back twist.
Okay, that's pretty good too.
And then you switch to the other side. Because you want to make sure you're even, right?
Right. Wow, I have more energy now than I did all day.
Let's see. What else does she make us do? Yeah, we're not going to do squats. Oh, you can do chair sit-ups. Which is basically, it's just standing up and down.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right, and for the elders, that is a challenge for them. And plus, the other one is like you can hug your knee, and that's a test on your flexibility if you can go that far up.
They're working up a sweat over here now.
All right, so I guess it's the top of the hour now. Welcome everyone. If this is your first hour or your 21st hour, welcome to 24 Hours of UX. Here with Alex. We are your nonstop community-based UX conference. It's nonstop because the conference brings you knowledge for the full 24 hours. It's community-based because the speakers are not selected by a central community, but proposed and hosted by a different UX community somewhere in the world every hour. And so we use this approach because we believe in the importance of the local UX practitioner communities, and we believe that UX should be just as much local as it is global. We have groups from New Zealand, Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. We're at the hour 21, and so there's just a few more hours to go. But it's still very, very awesome, and especially looking forward to this one. So over the day, we've had over 20 talks in 2 different tracks. The first track is more practical. The second one is more strategic. We've had around, I guess, 5 keynotes so far, and so I think there's just 1 or 2 more left, and then we have workshops. There's also workshops going on right now, so there's definitely a lot going on, and you will definitely not be bored. The group giving you UX wisdom in this hour is the Global UXD, and so here we have Alex. I'm going to hand the mic over to you in just a second, but first, a quick word on how you can interact in this session. So in the top right-hand corner, you have tabs for conversation and people in the session. And then from there, you can see tabs for chat, Q&A, and polls. If you want to, at the end, when we have time for Q&A, you will be able to raise your hand. It's in the toolbar on the bottom where you see a little hand sign, and then we can pull you up on stage, give you the mic, and then you can ask your question in person. Now, throughout the talk, you have chats, and then you have a Q&A. So if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. If you see questions in there, you can also upvote your questions so that we can also bring that up if you don't want to vote on questions or have questions on your own. So without any further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to Alex.
Cool, thank you so much, Grace. I will go ahead and share my screen. And let me know, can you give me a verbal yoo-hoo if you see my screen? Oh, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Let's see. Oh, okay, great, awesome. Cool, well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. We actually had a really great time last year at 24 Hours of UX, and loving just kind of seeing not only the new and improved format, but also how everyone is really communicating globally right now. And so this talk, how Silicon Valley globalized because of the pandemic and why that's a good thing, is a little bit different than the traditional types of talks I give. Usually I'm talking about more design specific related topics, but this is really more about the design meetup and Silicon Valley and the tech scene within itself. So first, a little bit about me and what Global UXD is. My name is Alex, and I've been a UX designer for quite some time. As of late, I've been in more marketing and management roles. And in 2014, I moved to Berlin, and I didn't know anybody in the tech scene out there. And so I started Berlin User Experience Designer, so Berlin UXD, which was a meetup group that really allowed me to interact with different designers and tech professionals. When I came back to the San Francisco Bay Area, there was San Francisco User Experience Designers that eventually became, or I should say, came to light. And so now we're operating in about 14 different cities, and that has all taken place over the last 5 years or so. There's a couple different things that we do, and really starting off with events. There's 3 different types of events that we host, and we have listed here talks, panels, and workshops, but in addition to seminars and talks, not unlike this one, we also host what we call the informal design critique, where it's kind of like a coffee shop session where we kind of get together in a coffee shop setting and critique each other's work. And of course, this is all pre-pandemic. And another type of event that we host is what we call a design jam, which is kind of like a hackathon of sorts. And we've actually done a virtual design jam that has been pretty interesting. We also host programs such as a series of events and mini conferences, and are starting to work on different types of products that help you from a design perspective when it comes to kind of either collecting your thoughts or collaborating with us in the meetup when you're working with us virtually. And we actually registered as a nonprofit this year, and so we're really excited about that. The goal of our organization, Global UXD, is to inspire and create change through global design. And so what I'm going to be talking about as the focus of this presentation is Silicon Valley and what people think of when they do think of Silicon Valley and how it's actually globalized. And no pun intended with the idea of our meetup group being called Global UXD. Because I think globalization is in this scenario, at least, not to get into the definition of that word, is quite interesting in this context. So defining Silicon Valley. So when people think of Silicon Valley, they typically think about the San Francisco Bay Area. And we'll dig into actually a little bit of a history of why Silicon Valley. And so if we think about a history of Silicon Valley, it really starts right here. And so post World War II, we started seeing a lot of researchers that had come to Stanford to work on different technologies. In the 1970s, they started working on new projects, new technologies, and they started realizing that there's quite a bit of other folks that are pretty well versed in tech research and technology, and many of the companies that we know of today were really founded. And so this blip is just north of Mountain View, what we would consider probably Palo Alto or Stanford, and a lot of the research actually took place in Stanford. And I want to show a picture of this house. And so this house is, I guess, the HP garage. A lot of people showcase the Apple garage, but I thought make it a little bit more of a different photo this time. And so this is, I guess, the garage where the founders of HP kind of started up the company. And there's actually a plaque there that says Birthplace of Silicon Valley. And so when we think about Silicon Valley and we think about meetups, technically the Silicon Valley region is closer to where that lower blip is, Mountain View. San Francisco is not technically part of Silicon Valley from a geographic standpoint, but nowadays we do include Berkeley and San Francisco. But even though we still consider the entire San Francisco Bay Area Silicon Valley, what we've realized is that people in the South Bay or Peninsula, so south of San Francisco, don't actually like to go up all the way to San Francisco to events. And folks that are living in the city in San Francisco, they don't like to go all the way down to the South Bay for events because the traffic, at least before, was really killer. So what we've done is we've split our meetup in the San Francisco Bay Area into two different groups, one being called Silicon Valley User Experience Designers, the other being San Francisco User Experience Designers. And they have different tracks, different meetups, and usually in-person events. But why that's interesting in the kind of the topic of today's discussion is what the pandemic has actually done, not only for those two groups, but to Silicon Valley tech in general. And I want to start with kind of what people are calling Silicon Valley exodus. And so you've been hearing that folks in the tech scene are moving to Austin, Miami, the Research Triangle, or Raleigh-Durham comes up quite a bit. And although that might be true, there's also data pointing to the fact that because a lot of these tech folks are working in companies that are based in California, they actually move to other parts within California as well, such as Los Angeles, Truckee, or what a lot of people know as the Lake Tahoe area, or even Sacramento, because there's cheaper housing compared to San Francisco or even LA. And so, excuse me. And so this was, I think, quite an interesting thing to think about in terms of the data I'm about to show you. And I want to kind of make a point that it's not about geographic. So the thesis is that Silicon Valley is globalizing, but it's not necessarily because of the fact that people have moved to Miami or have moved to Austin or whatever it may be. Now, I mentioned earlier that we host events in many different cities. So in addition to San Francisco and Silicon Valley. We've got meetups in New York, Toronto, London, and Berlin. If you are part of those groups, you might have found this talk through these channels. And thank you for joining this talk here, because I know there's an Adobe workshop going on right now. But if you've joined through some of these channels, or if you kind of see the types of events that we're hosting, we really had this kind of metric in terms of what kind of meetups were going on across kind of like the meetup community. And as much as I don't like to say that it's only meetup.com, meetup.com is very much kind of where a lot of people do meet or find meetups, and also start meetups. So it's been a great resource, although there are definitely other ways to kind of have meetup groups. But what we've been seeing is that traditionally in Silicon Valley tech, per week, there was around 15 or so tech meetups at minimum, and 3 to 5 of those were design meetups specifically. And so that's every week pre-pandemic in the San Francisco Bay Area. So it's quite a bit. And there were a few webinars, but most of them were actually sales pitches. And again, pre-pandemic, Zoom for webinars was not really kind of the norm for meetups. Now, in some of the other cities that we're looking at, whether that's Austin or London or Chicago is a big group that we have out there, we would be seeing that over the last couple of years, there's closer to 5 different tech meetups. And maybe there would be 1 design meetup per week. And again, a few webinars, mostly sales pitches and things like that. Now, once the pandemic rolled in, what we saw was this, oh, and before I actually jump into that, attendance rate for in-person events pre-pandemic was an average of 40%. So about 40% of all those who RSVP for a free event, we mostly host free events, would be about 40%. And that was a pretty consistent number. So if 100 people sign up, we could expect that about 40 attendees will show up, which is actually a good number to have for in-person events. Now, transition to during the pandemic, we're looking at virtual events. And so that number where we had maybe in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, about 15 meetups per week has now increased. It has jumped to 20 plus tech meetups, because the barrier to entry of finding a venue, getting the word out and asking people to drive to a particular location or take public transit or walk to a particular location has completely changed, right? So we have 20 plus tech meetups. It's cheaper to host an event. You don't need to worry about logistics or anything like that. And we're seeing more design meetups. We're seeing more tech meetups. What we've been doing specifically is that if we had been hosting a Silicon Valley or San Francisco event, we'd also promote it across Chicago, New York City, and if it was a morning meetup in the San Francisco Bay Area, we'd even post it to our London group for an evening event for their time zone. And so what we're seeing is a lot more, or what we saw was a lot more kind of meetups in general, which totally makes sense. Also a lot more webinars, and also virtual conferences became something that was much bigger than it was before. Now, starting off, we saw that there was about a 60% attendance rate for these online events. And so it's easier to kind of zoom into a call than it is to drive over to a particular venue. So this also made sense. And one thing that was actually interesting is that over time, we saw that this actually changed. And so our meetups were pretty much the same, posted just in different geographic regions. But over time, our Silicon Valley meetups kind of dropped in attendance rate. But the other cities for the same meetups actually maintained their 60% attendance rate. And there's obviously a couple different factors related. A couple of them I've listed here. So RSVP count was quite different. Sometimes in some of these smaller groups, we would just have a couple RSVPs here and there, whereas San Francisco would average 30 to 50, sometimes 60 or more and we would have to put a cap at meetups, and also the amount of the frequency of posting new events. Silicon Valley and San Francisco had quite a bit of events posted on a regular basis, whereas other cities, they didn't have as many meetups going on. So there wasn't as much awareness. And so what this actually has turned to is that, and kind of like the thesis behind why we're starting to see Silicon Valley globalize and what that exodus really means for us, is that it's very important to capture an online audience. And I'll kind of follow up as to the why this is important in just a second, but this is an example of a great meetup group that's in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's called Cascade. And this is their kind of meetup promo card from 2019. You have a list of speakers, you have the title, and if somebody saw this, they would think, okay, this is a meetup or an event. Well, they actually changed their model quite a bit. And so at the top, they actually, I think, rebranded to Design Career Network, DCN. And now you have this kind of a lot more engaging, direct to the point, no small text, one speaker, much more focused type of title card. And it makes sense because, well, one, you have an online event, so you can feature just one speaker and you don't have to get, a bunch of people in the room. Two, you can be a little bit more direct about the content because it is a little bit of a different logistical challenge to host this on Zoom. And what DCN, or Design Career Network, is doing very well is that they're also publishing all of their content to YouTube. And so what we started seeing is that in terms of building content in the design community, we saw groups expanding to YouTube, podcasts, recordings for all of the Zoom calls, and more activity going on in Slack channels, since it was a little bit harder to network before. And I put the URL actually for DCN in the corner there, so it's just designcareer.org. And again, they have a lot of great content that they post to their YouTube, but also these virtual events that they host as well. And so at the end of the day, I kind of want to make the point that it's not about geo, and it's about content. And the idea is that Silicon Valley, whether the Silicon Valley tech scene did move to Austin or Miami, or even if they stayed in California and moved to LA or Lake Tahoe, the interest in tech has kind of separated itself a little bit from Silicon Valley, not because of geographics, but because of the content that's being put out. And so looking at this a little bit closer, so what's happening? So companies are trusting remote work. Lockdowns are sending tech workers away. Digital content gets a huge push. There's just a lot more content being viewed. After you kind of get through your Netflix profile, then maybe you'll start looking up design meetups, or at least that's my hope. And remote actually becomes a cooler thing, because remote was always cool, but now it's actually cooler. And maybe the boss that never let you be remote before has now kind of forced the team to go remote because everybody else did. And why is it a good thing? So it's more opportunities for everyone. You don't have to be locked down to a particular location. It's better for business from a networking standpoint. Now, this, of course, doesn't necessarily exchange the in-person interactions you can have, but overall, if you do have a wider reach, it is better for business. It's better for the environment from a standpoint of the fact that people are not traveling as much, and tech becomes more distributed. I mean, we've always had distributed tech in terms of either offshore or nearshore work, but now it becomes a little bit more of a normal thing. But most importantly, and I think I forgot to mention that another reason why Silicon Valley had a boom, or still has a boom, is because of Sand Hill Road, where all of the investors are. Even the investors are becoming a little bit more distributed. And so I kind of want to leave that off before we jump into questions. I know we're coming up on time now, is that will we be forever globalized? And so a couple just notes on this is that local is coming back. And by the way, this is SAP in Palo Alto, one of our design jam events on the left side there. But one, local is coming back, so we're hoping to get back into this type of scenario where we have an in-person design jam. But hybrid events are expected. So if we had an event like this in the future, or when we do, we'll probably have a couple cameras live streaming the event, because we do want people that are in different locales to be able to tune in. And overall, virtual events have more weight than they ever did before. And also remote work has more weight. And so these are just a kind of a couple insights that we can grab from. This is the last slide, and I'll stop sharing my screen in just a second. And I think Grace will also post the URL. You can find me on Twitter at Shirazi. But I'd love to kind of open it up and see if I could answer any questions for those of you that are still on the call.
Hey, Alex, it's Marc. How are you?
Great to see you, Marc. I know we were exchanging some messages, but
exactly. Perfect. Well, I'm going to wait for others to post questions, and maybe there's some in the chat, but I did post one in Q&A, and my question was, what tips would you offer to help build great virtual content? And I guess now hybrid, but I mean, if it is about the content, is there some overarching philosophy that you have toward it?
That's a good point. And I think, to start off, I'll honestly say that we are still making the transition to this kind of meet up to content. And that's one reason why I used the Design Career Network, another group, as that example. But I think one thing that we've seen, whether it's in our own meetups that we're now, of course, recording and publishing online, but also some of the other projects that I've been touching, is that as many platforms as possible is always a win. And so what that means is that if you record a podcast, then you should have a little snippet for Instagram, you should have a story for TikTok or Snapchat, you should have a post on Twitter that links to a Medium or a blog post. And so as many times as you could replicate the content across different channels, you never know who's going to be on one platform but not the other. And so that's one thing I would say is super important right now. And I think to follow up, and I see another question, but to follow up, I think it's also important to note that this also takes a lot of time. Whereas when you're hosting in-person meetups and it's not recorded, or at least when it was not recorded in the past, you would host the event and then that would be the end of the event. And hopefully people had a great time. But now you're starting to see, okay, you've hosted the event, you can have now these different edits for the content, reaching out to the speakers, etc. So it does take more time, but I think it's definitely worth it.
Yeah, and you did see there was another question that was posted, and Peter had a question, and he said, online meetups strengthen a winner takes it all system. How do you see the downsides of this?
Oh, okay, I see. So I think to kind of poke into the question a little bit, I think what you're trying to say is that if there is one kind of prominent meetup, then everybody goes after that event. Is that, and maybe Peter, you can add another yes or no, but I'll kind of elaborate on that. There could be, when I first read the question, I thought, okay, there are no downsides to having all this content out there. But you're right. If somebody is posting a lot of content and there's just so much more noise, how does somebody filter through what's right or what's wrong? And I think that is a challenge. I think we end up seeing that you have to really consume more just to kind of get the things that you want to get out of it. And it also makes it harder to kind of cut through that noise. And so I think that, I guess it's a good and a bad thing, right? Having more out there, but then the problem is that how do you know what to look for or whatever it may be? Because definitely Google does not have all the answers. I mean, of course, if you come to 24 hours of UX, then that's all the right content you want to see.
Yeah, that's a great segue there. And Alex, we think we have another question here, but I was going just to remind everybody that we are going to continue. So we're going to ask a couple more questions here with Alex, but we wanted to let you know that you can stay here or you can leave. I know there's another session that's going to be starting here in just a little bit, and you're more than welcome to jump over to that other session. I believe it's How I Designed My Nonstop Learning Experience by Building Communities, and you can go to that one. And also, of course, if you're at a break right now, make sure you or stretch or do something, because we're heading into the final hours. So we want you to be totally attentive. But Alex, I guess the one question I was thinking about was, as you talked about, you've got all that kind of winner takes it all, I guess, mentality. There's a lot of content out there. And also I wondered how, when you running virtual events, are you typically doing a single track or are there multiple tracks? Because I've seen that there takes a lot of effort to have multiple tracks at an event. And if you do have multiple tracks, sometimes they compete against each other, and there's other routes because it's tough to gauge your audience. Didn't know if you had anything on how to produce multiple tracks as well. Any advice on that?
Yeah, this is, I think, an interesting thing to talk about, because our philosophy and kind of the types of events that we're always hosting and touching, they're for pretty niche groups. And so even in the in-person setting, when we do host bigger conferences, we try as much as we can to stray away from having multiple tracks. And I mean, aside from the reasons of the fact that it's just easier to do that from a logistical standpoint, when you're hosting an event where there's 500 people in the room, for those 500 people, or for each individual attendee, it often does become kind of a challenge to kind of pick and choose. Whereas if you look at bigger events, and CES comes to mind, where there's 20 different tracks going on at the same time, it's more of like, okay, if I miss it, that's okay. This is about networking, or this is the topic I came here for. Whereas I would say that, yeah, for our online content, we've stuck to one track, but also for our events, we also stick to one track. Yeah.
I think that's really good advice, because especially for those, like you said, you put up a lot of good examples around content that's out there, and it's so saturated. So it sounds like the message is, if you stay niche, if you're just doing a special event, stick down that track. That will keep the content fresh and then also unique enough to attract people.
It's definitely worked for us that way.
Great. I'm going to take a look. I'm trying to see if we had any other questions come in, and didn't know if you had any other final thoughts before we close up the session. We're right at the end.
I think that's it. I think I'll be heading to the next session myself, so hopefully I'll see you guys in the audience over there.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. It was excellent, and definitely have some inspiration from the event, from your session.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Take care. Thanks again, everybody.